The European Union is in big trouble. And that has been basically a foregone conclusion over the course of this conflict in Ukraine. The European Union has been the attack dog for the neocons based in Washington, essentially acting as the more publicly aggressive, yet arguably and obviously puny force militarily and politically in this situation, acting as a vassal to the United States all along the way. And of course, as this situation in Israel has taken people's attention maybe off of the conflict in Ukraine, we see a similar dynamic. The European governments, whether we're talking about outside of the European Union, the United Kingdom, or whether we're talking about France, whether we're talking about Germany, all of them stand steadfastly with Israel, mainly in part because of the US's influence. And the same has gone for Ukraine. And it's not a coincidence that Ukraine and its regime's leadership under Zelensky see themselves as another Israel, see themselves almost as the Israel of Europe, similar to how Colombia views itself as the Israel of South America, Latin America. But nonetheless, the big trouble for the European Union has been manyfold, and we're going to get into how that is manifesting in the current situation. But politically, we have seen leader after leader, Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz, Rishi Sunak, who I guess you can say the United Kingdom is outside of the European Union, but still very much part of Europe. All of these leaders have seen their legitimacy, their popularity decline as this conflict has gone on. And that is because the situation on the ground, not in Ukraine, but in Europe, has deteriorated as support for Ukraine has escalated. So there was always going to be political fallout from this. It was just a matter of time, and it was just a matter of when. And I think we are starting to see the rudiments of that. Of course, we've seen protests after protests in places like the Czech Republic, like in Prague. We've seen protests all across Europe against this, in France, against NATO, against the continuation of sending more aid. But now we're seeing a political fallout a little bigger. So in Slovakia, Robert Fico has won the election there earlier in October. And Robert Fico is very much opposed. They call him pro-Russian in the collective West because he's very much opposed to continuing the aid that Slovakia has been giving to Ukraine. And that has actually occurred. There has been a halting of aid in Slovakia after Robert Fico's election win. Bratislava won't send more aid to Kiev as parties oppose such support are in talks to form a new government. So this is from Politico. It says Slovakia's caretaker government said it has halted sending further military aid to Ukraine as political parties that oppose such support are in talks to form a coalition following last weekend's election. The outgoing bureaucratic government in Slovakia will not send any more military material to Ukraine, the government spokesman said. The country's defense ministry was considering sending a new package of aid. Former Prime Minister Robert Fico's leftist popular Smear Party won Smear Party. I'm probably butchering that. I do not speak this part of Europe's language well, or any part of Europe's for that matter, won the parliamentary election last Saturday after promising to stop sending weapons to Ukraine to block Kiev's potential NATO membership and oppose sanctions on Russia. Slovakia President Zuzana Kaputova on Monday said asked Fico to try to form a coalition government. He has until mid-October to do so. The decision about this issue should reflect the outcome of the parliamentary elections and should follow the outcome of the government formation talks which are taking place these days, said a spokesperson for Kaputova. A decision about the provision of military assistance at this particular moment will create a precedent for future changes of political power. Fico was forced to resign as prime minister in 2018 following massive protests in the country over the murder of an investigative journalist. So he is back. He hails from the left in Slovakia. Some have said he's more populist, that he's more eclectic. But regardless, it's this position that has placed the European Union on notice and has really begun what I think is a cascade effect, or will be a cascade effect politically in the EU regarding their support for Ukraine. But now I'm going to put on friend of the show, Scott Ritter, what he had to say about this development. Here is his 2-minute topic video on the victory of Robert Fico and what it means for the European Union. Let's take a listen.
Observers based upon this is the European Union in trouble. Well, according to some observers, based upon the victory of Robert Fico, the former prime minister of Slovakia, who ran and has emerged victorious in the recent elections, there are dark clouds on the horizon for European Union, for NATO, and for Ukraine. Why? Because Robert Fico has said Slovakia comes first. He is tired of Slovakia giving away money to the European Union, which is then sent to an endless war in Ukraine, when this money could be better spent at home in Slovakia in the interest of the Slovakian people. He's also, frankly speaking, a little bit sympathetic to the Russian position. He doesn't find that Russia's special military operation is the egregious violation of international law, this war of aggression that NATO and other European Union members have said it is. And frankly speaking, Fico draws strength from the example of Viktor Orban, neighboring Hungary, who has stood up to the European Union and NATO and the United States when it comes to Russia, the special military operation, and supporting the anti-Russian policies of the European Union. So if Fico is able to assemble a coalition, his party only won 22% of the votes, but if he can cobble together a coalition within the next 2 weeks, then he's prime minister, and his policies will be at the forefront in European Union, the United States, and NATO. We left wondering, is this just the beginning of a populist wave that seems to be sweeping through Europe that rejects the pro-Ukrainian, pro-American, anti-European stance that the European Union has embraced over the course of the past decades? We'll see. It appears that he does have support amongst other parties, and he will be able to build these, but it's hard to predict the future. What an interesting time it is. At a time when NATO, the United States, and the European Union speak of unprecedented unity, we're starting to see deep fractures in the actual unity of Europe. Hungary, Slovakia, who's next? Poland has elections just over the horizon.
So that is what Scott Ritter had to say. And I think that it is very apt because there is, right? It's not just a matter of Slovakia or Poland or Hungary, these countries that are now moving further away from the European Union orbit. It's also that even the steadfast, staunch loyalists in the European Union are struggling mightily. They're struggling mightily out of their support for Ukraine. This analogy has been used many, many times now. They've shot themselves in the foot, and many feet. They don't have any toes left. They're not really standing. There was once a time when countries like Germany, for example, were seen as the hope and the light of what Europe would be in the modern era, the end of the 20th century, the end of the Cold War, into the 21st century. Germany and countries in Europe formed the European Union as a way to almost show off what it meant to live in the post-Soviet era without so-called authoritarian communism looming just next door. But all of it has been destroyed, and they have no one to blame but themselves, because while on the one hand you could call them vassals and puppets of the United States, on the other, they have made very cold and calculated choices, i.e., and for example, e.g., maybe I should say, e.g., allowing Nord Stream to be blown up. So the situation in particular with Germany as the leader of the European project at this moment is so incredibly dire that it has the potential to really just shake up how Europe is configured. And it's all because Germany and all of the other European countries that have gambled on Ukraine have essentially lost that gamble. And they've done so on behalf of the United States as master now. And so I want to go over Germany. What's going on with Germany? Germany predicted to be the only major European economy to contract this year as recession lingers. So this is a recent report from September. But as I read this report, Mind you, this report is underestimating. They're trying to make it look optimistic that Germany is the only one. But as you read in the reports, is you per usual for the collective West mainstream media, how it usually is when there's a misleading headline or a kind of twisted headline, the content itself will say something a little bit different. So it says that the largest economy in Europe is expected to contract zero point 0.4 this year. That's zero point 0.6 percentage points lower than an estimate made in May. The European Commission also cut its growth expectations for Germany in 2024 from 1.4% to 1.1%. The latest forecasts point to a general slowdown across the region. So that's not as optimistic as the headline purports. The headline is saying that Germany is the only country that's going to contract. But the reality is that they're all stagnating and facing the possibility of contraction. And it's likely that actually over the last 2 quarters, Germany is actually going to, by the time this quarter ends, this economic quarter ends, Germany will have actually contracted by 1% over the last two. So it says Germany is set for a prolonged recession this year, the only major European economy to experience economic contraction during 2023, according to fresh forecasts of the European Commission, the executive arm of the EU. Europe's largest economy is predicted to post a 0.4% fall in economic activity this year. That's 0.6% lower than an estimate made in May, according to the Commission, which published new forecasts Monday. The institution also cut its growth expectations for Germany in 2024 from 1.4% to 1.1%. So that's not good. 2024 ain't here yet. And the winter is coming, and a lot of this has to do with, of course, energy shortages. The German economy has struggled in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with Berlin having to very quickly end years of energy dependency on the Kremlin. The International Monetary Fund said in July that Germany would likely contract by 0.3% this year, as I said. So, look, whose fault is it that Germany has had to quickly become independent of Russian energy, Russian gas and oil? It has to do, especially gas, has to do with the United States. The United States is to blame. The United States blew up Nord Stream, and Germany not only let it happen, but nodded all along the way. So top economists have dubbed the traditional economic powerhouse as the sick man of Europe. The concept was coined back in 1998 when Germany faced economic challenges, but now it's being resurfaced as Berlin registers deep declines in output. Data released in September showed manufacturing activity in the country falling at its strongest pace since June 2009, excluding the COVID-19 pandemic. Other economists disagree that Germany's current woes can be compared to prior downturns. Germany's situation today differs crucially from 1995 to 2004. First, Germany enjoys record employment, high demand for labor, and the most comfortable fiscal position in all major economies. That makes it easier to adjust to shocks. So that's an optimist. That's very much optimistic. However, those jobs are likely to go away and are already going away because of the massive deindustrialization that is occurring in Germany. So here's the overall situation in Europe. The latest economic forecasts point to a general slowdown. The 27 EU economies are expected to grow at an average pace of 0.8%. Mind you, they're not talking about Russia, which is actually going to double that, likely 2 to 3% growth over that same period. So they're not talking about how Russia is doing better than Europe, despite Europe being the one leveling hundreds, thousands of sanctions onto Russia. This is down from a 1% estimate in May. Going into next year, the picture is more downbeat than previously forecast. The European Union is expected to grow by 1.4% rather than 1.7%. Weakness in demand, in particular consumption, shows that high and still increasing consumer prices for goods and services are taking a heavier toll than expected. High inflation continues to be one of the challenges for the bloc. The latest forecast shows that consumer prices will come down in the coming months, but they are still likely to be above the central bank's target of 2% by the end of 2024. Headline inflation in the euro area, where 20 EU nations share the same currency, is seen at 5.6% at 2023 and then 2.9% at 2024. So prices are high. And of course, this contradicts this whole idea that you can just adjust to shocks by being employed. If you're employed and you are not making enough money to pay for the things that you need, then your employment is not really the source of your security anymore. You are working for a lot less. And that is what, of course, the Western economists don't want to talk about. It warned that price pressures might drag on for longer as the European Central Bank is due to meet Thursday and announce whether it is raising interest rates again. The central bank has, since July of 2022, increased rates by 4.2.5% in an attempt to bring down historically high inflation in the region. So, and that has led to the recession. Okay, that a lot of that. I mean, there are of course core economic factors that lead to economic stagnation and contraction, mainly, of course, being the fact that there is a whole lot of closures, deindustrialization happening because of less demand. But that decreased demand is the result of the energy crisis. It's also the result of years of austerity, where finance has been privileged over industry, and the fact that when that starts to happen, you begin to have the issue of wages not being high enough to keep up with not just rising costs, but also with just the status quo. So the inflation only piles on to what is a general reality, a cyclical reality for Western capital. But with that said, okay, uh, I'll show you the updated situation. So that was a kind of a review, a prediction. But here is the Eurozone economy is likely contracted this quarter. So even right now, as we're speaking, it says the Eurozone is likely to contract this quarter and won't return to growth anytime soon, a survey showed, as the dampening effect of central banks' long campaign of interest rate rises becomes clearer. So the HCOB's Flash Euro Composite Managers Index (PMI), compiled by S&P Global and seen as a gauge for overall economic health, rose to 47.1% in September from August 33 month low of 46.7. The reading was still below the 50 mark, separating growth from contraction. However, the Hamburg Commercial Bank said the bloc's economy would contract 0.4% this quarter, far worse than the flatlining predicted in a recent Reuters poll. A recession is becoming increasingly clear in the euro area. Unlike in the winter of 2022-2023, the economic weakness is not concentrated in Germany, which has suffered particularly bad from high energy prices. The increase in the ECB key interest rate by 450 basis points in the meantime is slowing down the economy in all euro countries. Although 2 years of unprecedented global policy tightening may have reached peak, major central banks have served notice that they will keep interest rates high and as high as needed to defeat inflation. The impact is now being clearly felt with shrinking business activity in Germany, Europe's largest economy, pointing to a contraction there due to a sustained decline in demand for goods and services. But they say supply and demand, 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 demand. What this means is that wages, this is always happens under global capitalism, but wages now cannot sustain the impact of these higher prices, of this inflation. And then you have the interest rates being they rise, they're being increased because they're trying to stifle people's consumption even further. People do not want to take out loans. They don't want to invest. They don't want a house. They don't want these things if the interest rates are high. I mean, we're all going through that, I think, in the audience. You tell me. But you don't want to buy a home. You don't want to buy a car. You don't want to buy assets, real tangible wealth. You don't want to build it if interest rates are high. This goes for business as well. So meanwhile, France's dominant services sector contracted at even sharper pace in September as falls in demand and new orders weighed in on the Eurozone's second biggest economy. In Britain, outside the EU, companies endured a much tougher September than feared, marked by growing unemployment and recession risks. So again, on and on and on and on and on. Risk, 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 recession, recession, recession. That is the situation for Europe, and it's going to have a political fallout. Indeed, it already is having a political fallout. Now, one of the things that Europe has attempted to do in order to make up for the complete and utterly suicidal policy that's pursued toward Russia is that it's trying to hedge its bets with China. On the one hand, the EU, European countries, the UK outside of the EU, and to be fair, there really isn't that much difference between what the UK does and what the EU does. The separation is very, very slim, if nil, when it comes to Russia and China. But as the EU has been aggressively pursuing a suicidal policy against Russia. It has attempted to balance a contradictory policy toward China. On the one hand, de-risking, probing, talking about how Chinese economic influence is malign and is harming the Eurozone, is harming their respective economies, while at the same time basically coming on their hands and knees, the European Union, attempting to restore relations so that they don't further decline and further go into a spiral into the abyss. And here you have Josep Borrell. He's coming back. He's coming back. So I don't know if you remember, and I'll pull it up in a bit, but Josep Borrell was actually supposed to visit China earlier in the summer. He was supposed to visit China right around the end of spring, early summer. And that visit was canceled. And it was canceled because relations with the European Union had reached a new low. But here you have Josep Borrell is going to China expecting to enhance exchanges and ease doubts, or at least that's what China is saying, that this is what it's supposed to do. So the China and the EU are expected to seek more exchanges, clear away some mistrust, and mend spats under Brussels' de-risking approach ahead of the China-EU summit. Chinese experts said on Saturday, after an EU official confirmed that the EU foreign policy chief Josep Borrell will head to China next week after previously postponing the trip twice. And there were a lot of rumors that, especially the June visit that was planned, that actually was China did not want to see him. An EU official who has not been named disclosed on Friday that EU's top diplomat will visit China from the 12th to the 14th of October, according to the AFP. Borrell will meet Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, to discuss bilateral relations as well as foreign policy and security issues. It comes after Brussels started a probe into China's electric vehicle subsidies, which China's Ministry of Commerce expressed strong dissatisfaction and firm opposition to on Wednesday. Brussels' approach of balancing its concerns over relying too much on Beijing while maintaining ties will likely be at the heart of Borrell's upcoming discussions with Chinese officials. Wang Yi, also a member of the Politburo of the Communist Party of China Central Committee, welcomed Borrell's attendance of the strategic dialogue during their phone call in August. Analysts believe that during his Beijing visit, Borrell aims to attend the China-EU strategic dialogue, one of the three pillars of China-EU relations, and prepare for the China-EU summit. Li Haidong, professor at China Foreign Affairs University, told Global Times that the focus of Borrell's visit will likely be on strategic communication and cooperation, clearing the way for exchanges in various fields such as economy, energy, people-to-people exchanges, and increasing trust on issues of mutual concern. Despite its desire for more autonomy in economic matters, the EU has been kidnapped by the U.S. on security issues and has had to take into account the strategic competition between the U.S. and China, which Europe has a broad and common interests with. China hopes that promoting strategic coordination and cooperation with the EU, Europe will become more powerful and influential on the global stage so that the global strategic pattern will be more balanced, instead of the Europe being held hostage by the US. That's a goal shared by China and Europe. Maybe. This is where I might differ with China a bit. Because if we are to be quite honest, if we are to be honest about the situation with the European Union, it is unclear whether the European Union, European countries truly want to be more influential. I think there is a struggle. We see that with France and the US, lots of spats. We see that, for example, in Niger. We saw that with regard to China when Macron went off script and went against the US's hostile policy on the question of Taiwan. So we've seen this, and we've seen this over the course of recent history. So sure, there are some divisions, but at the same time, it is unclear whether in the final analysis, European leaders are really prepared to take a leap of true autonomy from their US masters. I'm not so sure about that. So China hopes to work together with the EU to maintain the stability of relations and address global challenges together. And the full resumption of in-person exchanges between China and the EU started only in the first half of 2023, and the EU's misunderstanding and negative sentiments on China need to be gradually eased. So this is China's position. Okay. On September 25th, you had Chinese and EU officials holding high-level economic and trade dialogues in person in Beijing for the first time since the pandemic, with a new series of agreements in various areas reached. On Tuesday, the European Parliament approved a new trade instrument to enable the EU to respond to economic blackmail from a foreign country, which could be used by China hawks against Beijing. So the mixed and self-contradictory moves and signals from the EU reflect the mentality under the de-risking approach taken by Ursula von der Leyen, the EU president of the European Commission. This is an unelected, mind you, Miss Ursula. She is not elected. She's a selected leader, and that's the contradiction that is going to really play out here. The European Union needs China. I mean, the European Union cannot play the U.S.'s game against China. They can't do that. That will sabotage the EU's economy forever. I mean, there would be no coming back. But on the other hand, Europe, as we've seen with Russia, has been more than willing to, with all intents and purposes, and with no other better way to describe it, has been willing to chop its, pull the rug from out under itself, shoot themselves in the foot, all feet, take a bat to the knees. All of this has relevancy when it comes to Europe's policy toward Russia and China. So we'll see what happens, but China hopes that the EU will further clarify its concept of de-risking. Does it regard China as a risk, or does it regard the problems faced by China in Europe as a risk? Regarding China as a risk is not the proper way to treat a strategic partner. China and EU relations should have principle and main tone rather than being divided into cooperation, competition, and confrontation, which will never lead to a balance. It's possible that some areas of cooperation will be drawn into the track of competition or even confrontation when the EU is exaggerating security in a one-sided way. Dealing with the probe into electric vehicle subsidies could be a litmus test. If the two sides can resolve the issue through technological and political consultations, it will not only resolve economic frictions, but also enhance mutual political trust. If some European politicians, however, want the EU's China policy to change the EU's China policy traditions or just flex muscles, China-EU ties could remain unstable for a while. And so I honestly don't think China has many hopes here. I do believe that they will have candid and frank discussions about the probing and the hostilities and the rhetoric that's come out of Europe, in the EU in particular, especially Ursula von der Leyen. If you remember during Macron's visit, the joint visit, Macron and Ursula von der Leyen earlier this year, you remember what happened? She had to be put in a separate room. She had to go through security like everyone else. China was not happy. And indeed, China still isn't happy. But all of this goes back to the point that Europe is really on a suicidal path here. And it's going to continue to have political consequences, whether it's Robert Fico being elected, and the whole Ukraine aid situation becoming more and more tenuous as NATO countries, the EU, run out of gas, run out literally because of their sanctions against Russia, but really run out of military gas, not really having nothing to supply to the Ukraine effort, that proxy war project. And as that continues to happen, as the economic situation deteriorates into the winter, it's going to be interesting to see whether something like the Israeli-Palestinian row, the Palestinian resistance to Israel, or whether it's some other global conflagration, ends up de facto leading and pressuring forces in the collective West to begin to tie the knot on the Ukraine project in some way, whether it's a West buffer zone, a West Ukrainian buffer zone, some kind of conflict freeze, whether it's regime change in Kiev, getting rid of Zelensky via elections, or maybe some kind of selection process, assassination or displacement, or some kind of arrangement. But I think all of these factors, all of these considerations, right? The economic situation in Europe, the fact that the United States is also having a lot of problems domestically, economically. The US economy, of course, is not the healthiest, but it's still riding on Europe's back. But at the same time, with inflation still pretty poor in the US, with an election season coming up, with heavy and tough rhetoric coming from the GOP about Ukraine as an election issue, with Kevin McCarthy's ouster, with the fact that further Ukraine aid has been delayed and delayed and delayed after this failed counteroffensive, it's likely that the political conditions in Europe and the broader collective West are kind of coming to a close on the Ukraine crisis, on the Ukraine proxy war project that they have provoked and, of course, developed and nurtured over the course of the last not just year and a half, 2 years, but of course, since the Ukraine conflict, or at least this iteration of it, really began in 2014. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. The point here, though, is that the European Union, the UK, tagging right along, it's on a suicidal course. And that course is having political ramifications. And I think many people have probably been saying, finally. However, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. A lot of people thought Giorgia Meloni in Italy was going to be a stalwart of opposition against the war on Russia, and here she is exiting from the Belt and Road Initiative, while at the same time doing whatever the United States wants when it comes to Ukraine, being the first to be called to discuss what to do about Ukraine. If you don't remember the list of countries that Biden called after the failed House vote in Congress, Biden called a few countries to try to uh, consider, mull over. I don't know what they were really talking about, but Italy was on there. So it's going to be interesting to see how Slovakia and how, especially the further east you go in Europe, Poland, how things are going to shape out from here on in. We see the divorce with Poland. We see Slovakia changing. There's a lot going on, and we'll just have to keep our eye out for it. But we know the trajectory Europe is on, and that is disaster and catastrophe that only the people of Europe, only working people in Europe in particular, can change. Only they can demand that their governments change their tune, or that perhaps a new government is needed. Perhaps a new kind of leadership is needed. That is what is really on the table right now. And we are going to see what happens in the very near future. We're not talking months and years. We're talking weeks. We're talking that as each week goes by, as each new election occurs, as each new spill up and hiccup with the Ukraine conflict occurs, there is more change likely on the way. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.